Hello and welcome back to yet another ultralight fishing technique video. My friends, today I am going to be going over something I get questions on all the time, and that is how do I fish with a mule jig and plastic? Now, obviously there are numerous different retrieves that I use, so I'm going to go through a lot of those today. But before I get to those different retrieves, I did want to start by saying mule fishing was designed for the light line angler for multi-species usage, and because of that, it's all about versatility. So I'm going to start by saying there really is not a wrong way to fish with a mule jig and plastic. However, there are some ways that I've found work really good for me, and those are what I'm going to talk about in today's video. The other thing I wanted to say is I've actually wrote an article about this same topic, and it's on my fishanything.com website. You can check that out, linked in the description below. But for the time being, I am going to be going over the exact same topic in video form. And throughout today's video, I'm going to be overlaying a lot of fish clips and fishing clips from previous fishing trips. Right now, the weather's starting to get pretty cold, so that's why we're here in the office and we're talking about fishing rather than actually fishing. But I'm really excited for today's subject because I feel like this video is long overdue. Now, before I get into some of my favorite retrieves for a mule jig and plastic, I wanted to start off today's video by talking a little bit more about how I personally select a plastic. There are really two main things when it comes to how I choose from the mule fishing plastic lineup. Number one is, what kind of fish do I plan to target, or what kind of fish do I want to catch? If I'm looking to catch a lot of multi-species, and I really don't care what species I'm going to catch, I really am going to start with something smaller. If I want to go after a little bit larger game fish, maybe some big crappie, maybe some trout, maybe some bass, so on and so forth, I'm probably going to go after some of the larger mule plastics. Now, the next thing, number two, that I focus on is really forage. What type of food do I feel the fish are going to be feeding on in the situation I'm in? Maybe I'm in a shallow creek and there's a lot of crawfish present. Well, that's where I'm going to pick up something like the burrow bug. On the flip side, I might be in a pond with a lot of lily pads and other vegetation where there's a lot of insect larvae, a lot of dragonflies. That's maybe where I'm going to pick up a horsefly. So on and so forth. The list goes on. If the fish are feeding on minnows and shad, I'm going to go with a mule minnow. You get the point. Ultimately, it's all about what size do I want, what kind of species do I want to attract, and then really what kind of forage am I going to focus in on. Between those two things, that really helps me choose exactly what plastic I want. And if I'm really questioning it, I just go down in size. I like to go really small. I feel like the smaller you go, the more likely you're going to be able to catch fish of some type, because it really opens up a lot more doors. Now, let's get into some of those retrieves I was talking about. So today I'm going to talk about 5 different retrieves that I like to use, but obviously with a jig and plastic, there's probably 10 million different ways that you could technically fish it. These 5 are going to be kind of my foundation. These are going to be the things that if you focus in on these or some version of these, you're likely going to be able to catch fish all year long, no matter what the situation. So the first one I'm going to talk about is what I call the drift and twitch. Now, the drift and twitch is exactly how it sounds. The first thing you're going to do, zing your bait out there. You're going to get your rod then to about a 10 o'clock position, and you're going to reel down your slack. You're going to stop right there. You don't want to reel up too much. You don't want to actually move your jig. You're just getting your slack in a position where you can feel and detect bites easily. Now, after that, it's all about the drift, baby. When I say drift and twitch, I really want to emphasize drift comes first. It's way more important to let your bait do the work than it is to be twitching it like crazy. So let your bait sink, let your bait drift, let your bait get pushed around by the current, so on and so forth. As it's starting to get settled down, maybe it's getting towards the bottom, maybe it's getting around weed bed, maybe it's getting into a brush pile, that's where you're going to kind of probably start to twitch it out. Now, there's not necessarily one way to do this. Some people might be twitching it like this, some people might be twitching it like this. I would say, generally speaking, less is more. So please remember that on the water, especially with really light lures. Less is more. You don't have to twitch it like it's going out of style. You don't have to be, acting like your uncle on the dance floor at the wedding. It's nice and slow, nice little twitches, and then you let it drift again. Now, you may want to actually twitch it all the way back up to the surface and then execute that drift again, depending on how much water you're fishing in or where you think those fish are. But ultimately, the drift and twitch, it's obviously, that's a pretty high level definition. There's obviously a lot of different situations you could use this in, but it's all about fishing nice and slow and letting that bait do the work for you. If you take anything from today's video, make sure to take the fact that these baits are going to do more of the work than you need to do to them. You don't need to be doing a ton of stuff to catch fish on a mule jig and plastic. You need to just let that bait get out there and dance in front of the fish, and it will make them bite. Now this retrieve I really would use across pretty much any jig size, any size plastic, and I would just basically vary the retrieve style according to how heavy the bait is. If I'm fishing a 3/32 ounce mule jig in 5 foot of water, the drift and twitch is going to be significantly faster than if I'm throwing a 1/64 because the rate of fall is significantly slower. Generally speaking, I like to go with the lightest weight that I can get away with because I find that that drift is where you get most of the bites. As that bait is falling and settling down to the bottom, that's when those fish are going to come up and eat it. So generally speaking, I like to go lighter if I can get away with it, and I like to really fish nice and slow. The next retrieve that I wanted to talk about is what I call the drag and dead stick. Now, if you've been watching my channel for several years, you may remember this name from a lot of my Ned Rig videos from years past, and it's the exact same principle. The drag and dead stick is exactly how it sounds. A little bit different than the drift and twitch, because with the drag and dead stick, as the name kind of gives away, this is going to be a little bit more bottom oriented. So with the drag and dead stick, you're going to cast your bait out there, just like the drift and twitch, and this time you're going to let your bait actually settle to the bottom. Now, hence the name drag and dead stick. There are a couple different things that you could do here, and obviously it varies depending on conditions, depending on what weight you're using, depending on what depth you're fishing, so on and so forth, but really the principle is to fish your bait nice and slow along the bottom. This is going to work really well for those bottom-oriented fish. Maybe you've got some sluggish bass that are hovering around the bottom, they're down in the belly, their bellies are into the mud, so on and so forth. Maybe you're going after yellow perch that are just kind of sitting down there on a weed bed, and you really want to get that bait right in front of their eyes. No matter what, the goal is to get that bait down to the bottom before beginning your retrieve. Now, a lot of times, once I let that jig settle to the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and just dead stick it right off the bat. I'm going to let it just sit there. And if you're really, really patient, you'll be really good at this retrieve, because sometimes allowing your bait to just sit there for 10 seconds actually works wonders. I don't quite have the patience for that personally. A lot of times I probably work my bait a little faster, but the slower the better in a lot of cases, especially when those fish are lethargic, when they're cold, when they just don't really feel like biting. Now, hence the name. With the drag and dead stick, really the next thing that you're going to want to do, you may actually keep your rod tip low depending on how much wind there is. If there's a lot of wind, I like to keep my rod tip low to kind of avoid that line from getting blown around. If there's not too much wind, I may actually have my rod tip a little bit higher, and I'll probably just kind of drag it like this, just really light little drags of the rod. If that rod tip is low, I'm probably just going to go a little bit more of a side motion. You know, a couple inches with the rod tip is going to move that bait a lot more than you realize. So I would say don't need to drag your rod, 5-6 feet, generally speaking. It's more like a couple inches at a time, and that goes a long ways. Now, the drag and dead stick, I would say I really would like with something like a burrow bug, right? Crawfish a lot of times are going to be down there on the bottom of the water column. They're going to be scooting around on those rocks, around in that mud, around in that grass. And that little bit of a drag and dead stick and letting that bait settle for a while, that's going to do really good with those claws kind of sticking up, and then it swims and then it sticks up, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, if you can visualize what your bait is doing down there while you're making the retrieve, a lot of times that's really going to help. I would say whenever you're out there fishing, you should always try to think about, like, what is my bait doing in the water? And in this case, the goal is to make it look like something just scooting along the bottom nice and slow. Now, those last two retrieves that I just talked about definitely account for a huge percentage of my personal fishing techniques. That being said, the next one we're going to switch gears a little bit and go after something that's a little bit more niche, but it's extremely important, especially if you fish year-round, and that is the vertical presentation. Now, I'm holding this float right here because the vertical presentation technically a lot of times is executed under a float. You may do a peg float, rigged peg style, to where you're literally pegging it maybe 1.5 feet above your jig, and you're just fishing your jig straight under a float and drifting it around. You may rig it more of like a slip style float, and you get your bait down there 6 feet under the surface, or so on and so forth. And really the goal, with the name being vertical presentation, is you're wanting to present your jig vertically to where you can fish it significantly slower and keep your bait in one place. Now, you don't technically have to use a float to execute a vertical presentation. If you're standing on a dock, or maybe you're in a kayak or a boat, a lot of times you can drop your jig straight down beneath you, and you can do this above schooling fish the same way. It's almost like ice fishing. Ultimately, with a vertical presentation, this tends to be something that I would execute mostly in cold water. During those colder water periods, fish a lot of times suspend and they don't move around as much. So a vertical presentation is really the best way to get those fish to bite. And that's why I personally like a slip float probably more than anything. I'll run one of my Mule 1.25-inch peg floats about anywhere from 4 to 8 foot, depending on the depth, above my jig, and I will let that jig creep down there and I will just let it sit. And after that, I may twitch it a couple times to cover a little bit different section of water or just impart a little bit of action in my bait. But at the end of the day, the goal is to keep things really, really, really slow and keep things focused on a vertical presentation. If you do that during these colder water periods, right about now, November, December, January, February, that's probably going to catch you more fish than just about any other retrieve. It can be painful to sit there and wait, but I'm telling you, it is what you have to do to catch fish when those water temperatures are sub 40. I probably should specify that the vertical presentation can work any time of year. I personally use it a lot when the water's cold, but other times I may use it as if I'm fishing a shallow creek and I want to keep my bait just hovering right along the bottom. I may add a peg float just to put it about a foot over my jig, cast it out there, and just let my bait just drift at a specific depth. I found that that works quite well when creek fishing as well. Ultimately, there's never like a wrong time to fish a vertical presentation. My big thing is if I can get away with moving my bait a little quicker, I can cover more water and I usually catch more fish. So I try to avoid the vertical presentation unless the fish absolutely demand it. After the vertical presentation, the next one I wanted to talk about is what I call the Pendulum Retrieve. And the reason I wanted to show a mule minnow is because I love using the mule minnow with this retrieve. Although I'll use it with other baits as well, this is definitely the one I find myself using more often than not. And that's because I love this retrieve specifically for crappie. It works for a ton of different species. It works definitely for anything that's going to set up in a suspended manner. But I feel like crappie so often respond so well to this retrieve, and that's why I wanted to talk about it a little bit. I found myself crappie fishing a lot over these last couple years, and I would say I use this one all the time. Now, hence the name, a pendulum. It's all about getting your bait to just swing back to you. Some people may call it like tight lining. Some people literally may be calling it swinging a jig. But ultimately, the goal is to flip your bait out there or cast your bait out there not super far away and get your rod tip pointed up, and it's all about getting that jig to swing down through the fish. Now, the reason this works so well for crappie is because a lot of times those fish are going to suspend in the water column. So you may be sitting in 20 foot of water, pretend this is the bottom, pretend this is the top. Those crappie might be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast it a little past those crappie. I'm going to have enough line to where I can swing my jig right down to where it's swinging into that group of fish. And then once it gets to a vertical presentation, I may fish it a little bit more, just continue to execute that vertical presentation. But generally, I'm going to reel it up and I'm going to do the same thing. And the goal is really to get that bait swinging through the depth range those fish are hanging at. So a lot of times you may be doing this next to docks. You know, you obviously have seen me and heard me talk about dock shooting. You know, this is a lot of times the retrieve I'm going to use after I shoot a jig under a dock. Other times you may be out there in open water, there may be some brush piles, there may be a weed bed, and you want to get your jig to where it gets right down towards the top of that brush pile, but you don't want to get down in it. Well, it's all about line control. It's all about knowing where your positioning is. But if you can position your kayak properly, position your boat properly, and you get around those suspended fish and you execute this retrieve, I'm telling you, it is so much fun to catch fish on the old pendulum. Now, the other thing I will say is watching your line is critical. So I would say using a high-vis line, this is some yellow braid right here. That's one example. High-vis line is so helpful for the pendulum because a lot of times those fish are going to catch it as it's swinging down, and you may not necessarily feel the bite, but you'll see the line stop, or you'll see that line jump or swim to the side a little bit. And it's highly critical that you're able to see that to catch those fish, because a lot of times if you don't see it, those fish will let go of your bait. So I would say definitely use high-vis line pretty much for all these retrieves, but definitely the pendulum. Well, believe it or not, we are now to presentation number 5, and this one I kept super vague, and I'm going to give you a little bit of creative freedom in how you want to interpret it, but I call it the swim presentation. Now, the reason I wanted to name this one the swim presentation is because, technically speaking, the goal with this is just to talk about the fact that this is a faster retrieve. It's something where you're keeping the bait moving. You know, you may cast it out there and literally just reel it back. a nice slow reel, a fast reel, so on and so forth, you may cast it out there and do more twitching of the rod and reel while you're twitching. You may cast it out there and twitch it and then drop it and twitch it and then drop it. But the goal with the swim retrieve is to keep that bait moving back and to fish a little bit faster. Now, the reason I did this one last is because, quite honestly, this is probably one of the retrieves I use the least. I gotta be honest with you, more often than not, I try to let the bait do the work for me, and I don't want to overwork my bait. And I find that the swim retrieve works really, really well certain times of the year, maybe early spring when those fish are feeding up really aggressively before the spawn, maybe in the fall when they're starting to chase a lot of bait before that water temperature gets too low. But other than that, I would say more often than not, I find myself better off using the other retrieves and letting the bait do the work for me. And that's why I wanted to talk about the swim presentation last. I do feel that there are a lot of anglers out there, they see a bait like a donkey tail, they see that, boot tail that's gonna kick, and they immediately assume that casting and winding it is gonna be the best retrieve. But I will tell you from experience that you're better off using a lot of the other retrieves with something like this than a straight swim. In my experience, I've caught way more fish letting this bait fall and drift than I have straight reeling it. Again, I think you should have all 5 because throughout the year, there are going to be conditions that call for each and every one of these retrieves. And if you're able to kind of pull them out and try them, you will catch more fish. No matter what, I hope today's video kind of acts as a foundation for practice. Really, that's the big thing. You can sit here and watch me talk about all these retrieves, you can watch me catch fish on these retrieves, but what you really, really need to do if you want to catch more fish is go out there and practice with these and make them your own. You may find a retrieve that I didn't talk about today that actually works even better for you. I'm talking about ones that have worked well for my experience and my type of fishing. You may fish a little bit different than me. You may fish waters that are a little bit different than mine. So the best thing you can possibly do is go out there, fish, practice, have some fun, and I guarantee you're gonna catch a lot of fish. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for supporting Mule Fishing. I cannot believe that I started this in November 2019 and it's already, 4 years old. That's amazing. I truly appreciate it. It wouldn't be possible without each and every one of you. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day. Truly appreciate it. We'll catch you next time.